Hello everyone, today we read and comment the third chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. If we take a general view of the four elements composing the atmosphere in which war moves, of danger, physical effort, uncertainty, and chance, it is easy to conceive that a great force of mind and understanding is requisite to be able to make way with safety and success among such opposing elements. A force which, according to the different modifications arising out of circumstances, we find termed by military writers and analysts as energy, firmness, staunchness, strength of mind, and character. All these manifestations of heroic nature might be regarded as one and the same power of volition, modified according to circumstances. But nearly related as these things are to each other, still they are not one and the same, and it is desirable for us to distinguish here a little more closely at least the action of the powers of the soul in relation to them. In the first place, to make the conception clear, it is essential to observe that the weight, burden, resistance, or whatever it may be called, by which that force of the soul in the general is brought to light, is only in a very small measure the enemy's activity, the enemy's resistance, the enemy's action directly. The enemy's activity only affects the general directly, in the first place in relation to his person, without disturbing his action as commander. If the enemy instead of 2 hours resists for 4, the commander instead of 2 hours is 4 hours in danger. This is a quantity which plainly diminishes the higher the rank of the commander. What is it for one in the post of commander-in-chief? It is nothing. Secondly, although the opposition offered by the enemy has a direct effect on the commander through the loss of means arising from prolonged resistance, and the responsibility connected with that loss, and his force of will is first tested and called forth by these anxious considerations, still we maintain that this is not the heaviest burden by far which he has to bear, because he has only himself to settle with. All the other effects of the enemy's resistance act directly upon the combatants under his command, and through them react upon him. As long as his men full of good courage fight with zeal and spirit, it is seldom necessary for the chief to show great energy of purpose in the pursuit of his object. But as soon as difficulties arise, and that must always happen when great results are at stake, then things no longer move on of themselves like a well-oiled machine. The machine itself then begins to offer resistance, and to overcome this the commander must have a great force of will. By this resistance we must not exactly suppose disobedience and murmurs, although these are frequent enough with particular individuals. It is the whole feeling of the dissolution of all physical and moral power. It is the heart-rending sight of the bloody sacrifice which the commander has to contend with in himself, and then in all others who directly or indirectly transfer to him their impressions, feelings, anxieties, and desires. As the forces in one individual after another become prostrated, and can no longer be excited and supported by an effort of his own will, the whole inertia and the mass gradually rests its weight on the will of the commander. By the spark in his breast, by the light of his spirit, the spark of purpose, the light of hope, must be kindled afresh in others. In so far only as he is equal to this, he stands above the masses and continues to be their master. Whenever that influence ceases, and his own spirit is no longer strong enough to revive the spirit of all others, the masses drawing him down with them sink into the lower region of animal nature, which shrinks from danger and knows not shame. And these are the weights which the courage and intelligent faculties of the military commander have to overcome if he is to make his name illustrious. They increase with the masses, and therefore, if the forces in question are to continue equal to the burden, they must rise in proportion to the height of the station. Energy in action expresses the strength of the motive through which the action is excited. Let the motive have its origin in a conviction of the understanding or in an impulse. But the latter can hardly ever be wanting where great force is to show himself. Of all the noble feelings which fill the human heart in the exciting tumult of battle, none, we must admit, are so powerful and constant and as the soul's thirst for honor and renown, which the German language treats so unfairly and tends to depreciate by the unworthy associations in the words Ehrgeiz, greed of honor, and Ruhmsucht, hankering after glory. No doubt it is just in war that the abuse of these proud aspirations of the soul must bring upon the human race the most shocking outrages, but by their origin they are certainly to be counted amongst the noblest feelings which belong to human nature, and in war they are the vivifying principle which gives the enormous body a spirit. Although other feelings may be more general in their influence, and many of them, such as love of country, fanaticism, revenge, enthusiasm of every kind, may seem to stand higher, the thirst for honor and renown still remains indispensable. Those other feelings may rouse the great masses in general, and excite them more powerfully, but they do not give the leader a desire to will more than others, which is an essential requisite in his position if he is to make himself distinguished in it. They do not, like a thirst for honor, make the military act, especially the property of the leader, which he strives to turn to the best account. Where he ploughs with toil, sows with care, that he may reap plentifully. It is through these aspirations we have been speaking of in commanders, from the highest to the lowest, this sort of energy, this spirit of emulation, these incentives, that the action of armies is chiefly animated and made successful. And now, as to that which specially concerns the head of all, we ask, has there ever been a great commander destitute of the love of honor, or is such a character even conceivable? Firmness denotes the resistance of the will in relation to the force of a single blow, staunchness in relation to a continuance of blows. Close as the analogy between the two, and often as the one is used in place of the other, still there is a notable difference between them which cannot be mistaken, inasmuch as firmness against a single powerful impression may have its root in the mere strength of a feeling, but staunchness must be supported rather by the understanding, for the greater duration of an action, the more systematic deliberation is connected with it, and from this staunchness partly derives its power. Alright, so as you've heard, von Clausewitz concentrates on these passages on the quality that is required to the commander to fundamentally carry on the fight, right? And this is complicated because when he is fighting, essentially the enemy is producing damage to the means he is using, and albeit this can more or less reflect on himself as a person, I mean, in the direct harm that it can receive, still the responsibility that derives from these losses is becoming a very heavy burden, right? That is more kind of a moral one than a physical one. Naturally, there are also certain physical requests that are demanded to military leaders that are also equally important, because never to forget that actually tiredness and therefore has, for example, a dramatic influence on the decisional capabilities and so on. But von Clausewitz now analyzes chiefly the relation how the damage on one general's armed forces reflect on the will, essentially, of the commander to keep on fighting. So, restarting reading, he introduces the topic in this way. If we take a general view of the four elements composing the atmosphere in which war moves, which are danger, physical effort, uncertainty, and chance. So all things that we have observed now in the previous videos in our cases. It is easy, right, to conceive that a great force of mind and understanding is a requisite to be able to make way with safety and success amongst such opposing elements, which constitute a force that, according to the different modification arising out of circumstances, we find termed by military writers and analysts as energy, firmness, staunchness, strength of mind, and character. So long period, but basically the concept is very clear, right? So war is dominated effectively by, in order of importance, danger, physical effort, uncertainty, and chance, right? So it's important to consider them in sequence in this sense, because they all, as we have seen the other times, intervene in different ways. They're intertwined. This is what von Clausewitz is saying, and they represent basically the opposition to the military action in a bit in everything, really. It doesn't even need there to be actually an enemy for these things to intervene. As a matter of fact, a military expedition, even against an easy target, can be difficult for many reasons, right? And we don't even know which one they can be. So here we are touching, for example, on uncertainty, and chance, etc. But also the same idea of danger and the physical effort that is obviously to be considered in a physical world is important all the time, right? So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that there are some qualities, right, that are fundamentally mental before even the physical, that are required to fight in this sense. That is force of mind and understanding. So force of mind and understanding, here you realize that they're a bit of a different thing, and actually von Clausewitz explains this at the very end of the passage that we have read, if you remember. So we will explain later what the difference fundamentally is, but essentially the force of mind, this ability to go on no matter what, right? You can be intelligent to have this kind of understanding, but doesn't mean that you're able to exist under stress, right? And we all have a breaking point. So this is particularly important because we're not talking about an ideal world where there is the general that never breaks, right? And because naturally this is not just a matter of mental, dimension, but it's naturally tied even to the physical nature, right? Under stress, under sufferance, etc. Your whole organism is messed up. So you have to give up at one point. Now it takes someone who can bear this for longer, at least than the average, or up to the task, which is not a guarantee on the successful outcome of the military expedition, but it's better than nothing, and definitely it has to be there at all moments. And von Clausewitz says why? Because fundamentally that stress will arrive, right? It's not like picking flowers. This is war, right? So von Clausewitz writes that military writers and analysts, so the chroniclers, basically define this quality with different terms. So we have read it: energy, firmness, staunchness, strength of mind, and character. So these are all also elements that, as you understand, they are similar, right? In fact, von Clausewitz right after this says all these manifestations of the heroic nature might be regarded as one and the same power of volition. So it really is, right? Here it's a sum of elements that are primarily spiritual, if you want, and that all intertwine with each other, right? You have to have these qualities, one or another, to form a combination that makes you going through the combat in a way that can support you into it. And however, they can all be regarded as one, as the same power of volition. So it's a matter of will at the end of the day, modified according to circumstances. This is also particularly important to understand. Always remember that von Clausewitz has said previously that the spiritual forces, the moral forces, let's say, are the most important ones, but at the same time the ones that tend to swing, to fluctuate more than else, right? You can have obviously also physical decline, but generally, what you can do if you're fed and etc. is more or less what you are, your body strength, your resistance, your stamina, etc. But moral really does suffer a lot of blows, and it's very flexible in this sense. So everybody can get to, from particularly courageous to particularly cowardly, or particularly excited to particularly demoralized, etc., as you can imagine. And von Clausewitz writes then, but nearly related as these things are to each other, still they are not one and the same, and it is desirable for us to distinguish here a little more closely, at least, the action of the powers of the soul in relation to them, right? So von Clausewitz once again is this fine scoper, let's say, of the human mind, nature, and he's interested in here, as always, to observe how these qualities of the mind interact. Then he goes on and says, in the first place, to make the conception clear, it is essential to observe that weight, burden, resistance, or whatever it may be called, by which that force of the soul in the general is brought to light, is only in a very small measure the enemy's activity, the enemy's resistance, and the enemy's action directly. This is particularly important. So here von Clausewitz switches to the leader's level. This is it's a sort of an approximation, because obviously every combatant is kind of has a part of leadership in everything. If anything, you have to be responsible for yourself. But this switch of focus towards the commander now is important, because the commander is the one that, at least at a certain level of the military hierarchy, is not in fact directly engaged into the fight, right? It's engaged into the fight, broadly speaking, as we have defined the war as the struggle, etc. But is not really all the time in the first line, not always, at least. And obviously, the reason why this ranks exist is to let the leader not being annoyed by, mortar shells or machine gun fire, where he's trying to figure out what's the best action to take. It's preferable where he is a little bit distant, which from the commanders of companies upwards, let's say, it's is fundamentally the case, because they don't quite command from the field, or at least they do, but not really in the first line, right? So they are in a condition in which they have to work more like minds and less as bodies. And so this is what von Clausewitz is really saying. It's not that the enemy, while the general is fighting, is really like hitting him directly. Obviously, can happen. Lots of generals that fought even in the first line, thinking about World War the First, contrary-wise to what is commonly thought, many generals actually died. If you look at the British Army, what it was really the thinking of that, and this is also important. This is also inspiring. It's also part of what von Clausewitz will explain later. That it takes a lot of strength at one point to commit the troops to go on, and particularly in that case, it was true. I mean, the presence of the leader from the field is particularly inspiring in some ways, actually in many ways. But here von Clausewitz has made this specific case, because he wants to show us what is that most of all tends to impact on leadership during combat, right? That is not actually what the general's body takes. It's really what the general mind takes, right? Indirectly, right? I mean, it's partly coming from this sheer mass, physical destruction, right, of his own soldiers, and that's the burden that indirectly comes on him, morally. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the enemy's activity only affects the general directly in the first place in relation to his person, without disturbing his action as commander. If the enemy, instead of 2 hours, resists for 4, the commander instead of 2 hours is 4 hours in danger. This is a quantity which plainly diminishes the higher the rank of the commander, right? So it's basically what we already said. The higher you go in the military hierarchy, in commander's ranks, and the more the commander is detached from what is happening directly on the battlefield, right? And in fact, von Clausewitz here asks, what is for one in the post of commander-in-chief? It is nothing, right? They are behind a desk. But that is not less important. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, secondly, although the opposition offered by the enemy has a direct effect on the commander through the loss of means arising from prolonged resistance and the responsibility connected with that loss, and his force of will is first tested and called forth by these anxious considerations, still we maintain that this is not the heaviest burden by far which he has to bear, because he has only himself to settle with. All the other effects of the enemy's resistance act directly upon the combatants of his under his command, and through them react upon him. So here once again he's basically repeating the concept that there is no direct impact on the commander-in-chief, but just an indirect burden, right? That derives from what the enemy is doing on the battlefield. That is annihilating your own forces, right? And this has, as we will see now, an impact on the commander. This is very, very tough, very, very tough to bear. And von Clausewitz says, as long as his men, that is the commander's men, full of good courage, fight with zeal and spirit, it is seldom necessary for the chief to show great energy of purpose in the pursuit of his object, right? This is obvious. I mean, this is very, it happens all the time in military history. That you have an army that fundamentally, for the way it is built up, right, can achieve a success even if the commander is not, so heavily committed, right? The term winning hands down. It's never quite like that. In fact, I don't like the term actually. There is always a form of commitment, but it's obvious here. Von Clausewitz is representing kind of a positive moment that happens, right? The troops have high moral. They are well trained. The commander gives them the orders that are they're trained to carry out, and things proceed rather well, especially if the situation is easy, right? So that the danger is not particularly high. But and this is where things get more interesting. Von Clausewitz says, as soon as difficulties arise, and that must always happen when great results are at stake, remember, then things no longer move on of themselves like a well-oiled machine. The machine itself then begins to offer resistance, and to overcome this, the commander must have a great force of will, right? So, difficulties arise, and this is absolutely nothing that rare either. Actually, the difficulty is always there. It also in here it changes depending on the circumstances, but things are meant to be. I mean, always remember that wars are generally fought by with certain odds that are pretty even, right? Very rarely wars are fought if there is no hope to win, and you don't have to imagine the odd as just, I don't know, numerical ratio. No, it's not like it works. I mean, war, as we've seen even previously with von Clausewitz, has this infinite possibilities that can present, most of which are absolutely not predictable. So let's say that this adds a little bit to the to the viable options, or at least to the bet, right, properly meant in terms of chances. But generally, who fights against someone has at least an idea that he can win by some, that the odds are not so desperate at the same time. So these difficulties arise pretty often, because it's pretty easy to find someone who is there to resist you and counter strike. And here von Clausewitz precises that the difficulties situations arise because great results are at stake, as you understand. This is war. People get killed by the foe. So this is really, something that engages, certain, where lots of things are at stake. Many important things are. Then, because it says, things no longer move on themselves like a well-oiled machine, right? And that's where the concept of attrition, even if here he's not really explaining it, but it takes, it appears, because here he uses this brilliant metaphor that is aimed exactly at this, make us understand what happens is that not only does, the machine is, let's say, obstacled, but it starts within itself to collapse, right? It's the machine itself that begins to offer resistance. So this is particularly important because it makes you understand that it's not just the enemy that strikes you, and that's what you have to consider. It's really what happens for your own side. That scrambles basically things from within at all levels, at a moral level, at a physical level. It increases chaos and makes everything more difficult to control. And here, bear in mind, we're talking about the commander, so it's the person who has, to have this broader sight and understanding of what, at least of his armed forces, for not talking about the general situation where he's leading this machine, right? And that's where the commander's skills have to be really the one that matter, because as von Clausewitz says, now the commander must have a great force of will. Because there is no easy, there is no shortcut, right? You have to stay there with your mind. You have to resist. You don't have to give up. You don't have to lose, a spirit. You have to remain there and take that situation, as difficult as it is getting. It doesn't take to just stay there physically. You have to work with your mind in a situation in which you're stressed, put under great pressure. And here von Clausewitz says another very interesting thing. By this resistance, we must not, so the one within the same commander's army, we must not exactly suppose disobedience and murmurs, right? Although these are frequent enough with particular individuals. It is the whole feeling of the dissolution of all physical and moral power. It is the heart-rending sight of the bloody sacrifice which the commander has to contend within himself, and then in all others who directly or indirectly transfer to him their impressions, feelings, anxieties, and desires. So, what von Clausewitz is talking about in here is that you can't have definitely an army that is not this great match by the foe. Mere conscripts without particular training that already maybe do not want to be there, so maybe they're disobedient, they murmur, maybe they turn away, that they mutiny or stuff like that. So this is kind of a limit case that that the same von Clausewitz says, however, that is frequent because it's obvious that's part of even how armies melt apart normally. When think about defeats, etc., how that happens. The whole thing disintegrates often, in that there are always particular individuals that lean towards that side. Right, there is always an amount of the population of your army that is statistically be wanting to flee for willingly, right? So here it says, let's leave this thing aside because obviously it can happen, but this thing goes really beyond. I mean, even assuming that your troops were all perfectly faithful, committed, and courageous, and determined and trained and displayed, in fact, the same qualities that you're seeking, even partly into a commander by a certain degree, because here there is also the rank, so not just the soldiers, the NCOs, the other sub-officers, etc. But here it's the whole feeling of the dissolution of all physical and moral power, right? The heart-rending sight of the bloody sacrifice. So here, von Clausewitz is really making you understand that there is no superhero, right? That you can't think that an army basically goes there just to be butchered and without blinking, eyes and just doing it, because every time you meet an enemy, you start fighting, people die, you get hit, the situation gets the worst possible. Units lose order, cohesion. They don't understand what's going on, because it's perfectly normal, actually, especially from the field, right? The commander should be the one that is the great mind that is able to understand what's happening on the field, because he's getting reports from all over the place when his army, but the single unit doesn't actually understand what's going on. This is perfectly normal. Even if you study military, sources of battles, etc., you realize that even eyewitnesses, most of the times, do not understand what's going on. But it's perfectly normal. Do you think we know, a battle like Azincourt, like it went? There are like tens of sources, many of which are actually were there, and you think that they got what was going on? We don't know. In fact, we don't know what happened there for real, like in most battles happens. So the problem really gets real, right? It's the whole feeling that you're getting hit. When you see someone that that is blown up by a shell, and you say, "What the?" You feel the loss. You feel the loss not just because you knew the guy or something, but because you see basically that you can't get dismembered in a blink of an eye, and that you get traumatized by that, and you lose an order, discipline. Even the best trained special forces in the world, when at a certain point they do have individually a breaking point to start behaving just like apes, even smashing enemies' heads with a rifle like used like a club, not even shooting it properly the way they are. So that is the realm of confusion. Really, that is there is this looming threat of danger that is in front of everybody's sight, and it's son of the and here what he says, that it's terrifying, the heart-rending sight of the bloody sacrifice. I know most of us cannot know what this means, fortunately, and we're really better off with that. But if you want to study war, you have to understand what that means. You can't remain indifferent to it. You can't, and bear in mind that here von Clausewitz was a general. He was someone who made it through the ranks. He saw it all. He knows what it is. So from all he has looked at war all the way through it. And it's even more meaningful because there is even been in the 20th century this stupid culturalist and pacifist criticism of von Clausewitz thought that was basically realizing that a war is bloody. Well, thank you, genius. If you study history, well, it must have been a great surprise, wasn't it? And therefore say, well, von Clausewitz, this idea that generals that were studying von Clausewitz were just, disconnected individuals who sent to die millions of people without understanding what was going on. This is a very ill-conceived understanding of military history, even of the 20th century, of even episodes like the World War I that many people actually still believe today. I mean, like the fact that generals were just bunch of megamaniacal, idealists that just wanted things to be done without soldier counting in the process. Of course, there was this too, and von Clausewitz writes it. So it's not really, if these guys really understood von Clausewitz in the first place, they would know that. So this is absolutely not the point. And still, the way war really works is not just, if these commanders had been just a bunch of clowns that didn't know what they were doing, they would have been, simply overthrown. And you can't really impose, this is the point really, also von Clausewitz shows here, such a huge sacrifice without having military logic in the process, right? But it's nevertheless meaningful, in fact, that von Clausewitz here says what the point is that the commander must know what's going on there, what the feelings of his men are, and because this is not an option, because he will get the consequences of this indirectly on himself, right? Why? Because what von Clausewitz says in here, first of all, the commander has to contend within himself because of this, and then in all others would directly or indirectly transfer to him the impressions, feelings, anxieties, and desires. I mean, when you find one of your subordinates that comes straight from the battle, covered in guts and blood, and it tells we have seen hell in there, we are being butchered down, well, you can't just be, well, okay, who cares? You're seeing the sacrifice, you know what's going on, because that depended on you. You gave those orders. You gave that command. This is something shocking, and humanly speaking, we're meant to respond, to empathize, to understand what that means, right? So it's no joke. Also, because the guy, that presumably, let's assume that you made a wrong decision. Well, this person is very likely going to tell you, how many times in history the commanders have made mistakes, and people told them before, like, we can't. Like at Gettysburg, right? The Pickett's charge. The word Lee was told. We can't take that hill. And yet that was the tunnel vision, the thing. But after that, you start realizing what it means, because when you see your whole army, I mean, what remains of it in that case, coming back, people, dying, wounded, shocked, traumatized. I mean, charging against the mitraille. It's no easy thing to watch even. So this thing has an impact also, because this is not, war is not just a scientist's experiment that is detached from reality. I mean, those are your countrymen. Those are people that live with you. You have a name, you have a responsibility, you have a duty. So there is, a lot that is gonna fall upon yourself, even for taking those wrong decisions. So here von Clausewitz is simply telling you this happens all the time. It's always recognized in a way or in another. And you're not alone. I mean, you're not the commander of all. You're working with other officers, you're under someone else most of the times. And in general, the bigger, in fact, the rank is, the greater the responsibility overall is. I mean, think of what it means to, command a front where millions of soldiers are engaged. Well, you're even if you were the most reckless and absolutely disillusioned person there, you wouldn't even be a good commander, because you wouldn't have, and that's what here now von Clausewitz will explain, you wouldn't have even ambition to do well. And here ambition is a key word, because at that point it's probably the best element, as von Clausewitz will say, that will move the commander towards the direction of being himself committed, and as you know, that's directly, it's inversely proportional to making, to making to be defeated and to show in front of others to have failed. That's really the problem, right? So, and I would also stop in this. I mean, all these impressions, feelings, anxieties, desires. Here we observe that these are all kind of irrational. At least aside from impressions, right, that can be partly obviously deriving from a rational assessment of the situation, but feelings, anxieties, desires, right, they're all things that can even be very conflictual among each other, and they're definitely, fear is contagious, right? It's these are we were already seen in the previous paragraphs how fundamentally human nature tends to to stop in front of danger, right? And that's the tendency. There's no normal tendency of generals really throwing men into the meat grinder without hoping to to break through, right? And to make it, and so because this thing eventually reverberates on themselves. So von Clausewitz goes on, says, as the forces in one individual after another become prostrated and can no longer be excited and supported by an effort of his own will, the whole inertia of the mass gradually rests its weight on the will of the commander, right? So in other words, this machine is losing momentum. Is getting, it's losing its fluidity. Let's say its flexibility. It's starting to freak out in some way. So at this point, the commander is the one that has to take on himself the responsibility of pushing further, right? And this is real challenge. And obviously there are moments in which there's not much you can do, but there are many scenes. Think about Napoleon at Waterloo, trying to reorder the old guard while the Brits were attacking one side, the Prussians from the other. I mean, that was a desperate situation, dramatic one, and here you see that even Bonaparte, with all his charisma and and name, and that was the old guard. So those were the men who would believe the most in him. But in that situation, the whole thing was lost, right? So, but the fact that he got in the midst of them, under fire, risking his life, it was this kind of ultimate extreme attempt to make them resist, in spite of all. And he was definitely very committed. He was drawn away from there, almost against his will. So here von Clausewitz starts defining it says, by the spark of, talking about the commander, by the spark of his breast, by the light of his spirit, by the spark of purpose, the light of hope must be kindled afresh in others. Insofar only as he is equal to this, he stands above the masses and continues to be their master. Right? So he has this very difficult task to elevate himself over the herd, let's say, because he is effectively the leader, and has to re-inspire these feelings within his troops. Then von Clausewitz says, whenever that influence ceases, and his own spirit is no longer strong enough to revive the spirit of all others, the masses drawing him down, with them sinking to the lower region of animal nature, which shrinks from danger and knows not shame. So here von Clausewitz also presents this extremely dark picture that we rarely tend to picture, to portray, in also culturally speaking. Here von Clausewitz has presented the case where the commander's leadership ceases in a way or another, right? He's not specifying, here says where his own spirit, well, actually, yes, it's not strong enough to revive the spirit of all others, but this naturally can happen in even against his will, right? Maybe he still has the spirit, but the whole thing is there, is crumbling by itself, so there's not much you can do, right? But here, the darkest point is not just the enemy pressing on and destroying the army and the bloodshed ensuing. That is what we try to focus on. But here von Clausewitz looks actually at what happens within the same army that is going to be defeated. I mean, these troops sink into the lower region of animal nature, right? This is not a matter of the enemy massacring you. This is what you turn into when you lack a leader, when you lack an order, when you lack discipline, which shrinks from danger and knows not shame. So here he's not referring just to cowardice in the sense, the guy fled. Here, think about cowardice practically, and think about how many, always making examples with World War the First. Recently, even with the anniversary of the 100 years of the First World War, there has been this pretty, agreeable tendency to rehabilitate definitely all those people that were those soldiers that were executed for the accusation of cowardice, right? That is usually portrayed like you didn't obey orders, you stayed there, all the problems, the psychological ignorance even sometimes of the soldier, right? You didn't attack, you fled, you retreated without an order, you were a coward, point, you have to be put to death. Actually, naturally, yeah, these things happened at this level of infamous accusations. Sometimes people were just doing their duty and maybe they just lost it, like because they couldn't bear it, so they remained traumatized, etc. They couldn't do much, and at the time there was not much huge understanding of this, but in general, let's say, aside from this specific contexts that, by the way, always existed in history, they were just intensified by the sheer amount of destruction and in fact destructive capabilities that were first unleashed during World War II, and that's World War I in that specific warfare that came to characterize the conflict. But the collapse of an army is by default what happens in every battle, right? From one side or another. Yeah, okay, there are some armies that even when defeated can retreat orderly, but let's assume here what von Clausewitz is saying, when the commander loses control in his army, what happens is really it's a nightmare. And there are lots of people who do absolutely shameful things. That is to say, put yourself into safety, maybe just, passing by people who need help with it, etc., just for save your own life, doing other things that maybe are not so noble, not so conscious, and that can turn in a true crime. Like, and this is important because when, for example, you abandon the post, etc., of course, this starts to happen at a certain point, but there are people who do it regularly, and because they can't stand it and they think that they're gonna die, and I'm not saying that we have to judge them, but believe me, if von Clausewitz wrote it, it's because it's the case. Here, the loss of the general's leadership does bring his soldiers to naturally this animal state of nature that is boundlessly shameful. I really can't acquire this state, and this is to be borne in mind. Also because, by the way, well, whatever, let's not digress excessively. I mean, I wanted to say that there is always that actually someone that sacrifices itself in every route, right? This is something that you can't find everywhere in military history. Usually, in great retreats, great defeats, there is always someone that stands there to get butchered down, like the old guard at Waterloo, la gare de meurt ne se rend pas, right? That's the concept. But you can't find panic, and we know what humans do when they are in panic. They can get really, in fact, animal-like. So here from Clausewitz is perfectly realistic in this assessment, without even getting into the details of what shameful behavior can really be about. And it's interesting because it's as if if the army is without a head, the whole thing collapses simply. That's the idea. If there is this disconnection between the command and the troops, even what lays in the middle usually tends to crumble, right, at the same time. Also because the chain of command works like this. If you don't receive order from the top, which is ultimately the one that is taking the main direction, you can do something at a lower level of organic, but still units are meant to fight synergically speaking. It's not that a platoon commander can do much when the whole division is crumbling, right? So it's important, in my opinion, to stress this concept. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, these are the weights which the courage and intelligent faculties of the military commander have to overcome if he is to take his name to make his name illustrious. And here we see that the concept of ambition is starting to rise, right? So, in other words, what Clausewitz is saying here is that a commander that cannot, that doesn't display this force of mind and understanding, is not gonna make a great display of himself in general. So that his name will be remembered in shame, fundamentally. It's hard for us in a largely Pacific context to understand what that means. But on the battlefield, I mean, the concept of responsibility, of duty, is really important, because if you take the wrong decision, people die. So this is not just an act of simply free will. This is something that has to take into consideration. It's a very difficult problem solving, right? It's not like in movies where villains in the place of commanders do very stupid things, and you say, oh, the good guy just did it because it's bad. No, this is really something that happens all the time to anyone. You're put into a situation with which you really do not know what to do. That's what is often not showed, that you don't know what the hell is going on. And it's very difficult to understand if one doesn't focus on what the battlefield really is, and that's why von Clausewitz actually takes a lot of of space in the Vom Kriege to describe to us what it's really like. We will arrive to that point in which he explains what a battlefield really is from his own, from an individual perspective, someone going there. So these weights, von Clausewitz writes, increase with the masses, and therefore if the forces in question are to continue equal to the burden, they must rise in proportion to the height of the station. So this is an important conception in hierarchy. That is to say, the larger, it's pretty obvious that the larger an army it is, and the more the responsibility has to fall upon the higher ranks. And this is the concept of organics in a nutshell, and he explains it very interestingly through this fact, that is that the burdens that are to be the commander has to take them himself have to be proportioned to this level of command, for which you cannot, you need a higher leadership in order to manage big masses of men. You can't let it do from the single units on the field. You have to have an overview and an understanding and a strength of mind and an that is necessary and required to to control the wall, right? And this goes in parallel with the burdens, so that we should not believe that the higher general is the kind of the evil guy that doesn't know what's going on the field because he's detached. He perfectly knows that. If anything, if he has been able to reach to that, it's because he had displayed, hopefully at least. Obviously there are corrupted militaries around the world, historically speaking, but that's one point. In fact, when you put an unqualified commander in a position that is evidently not cut for, disasters ensue in a regular pace. So it's very interesting to conceive the hierarchy of ranks in the military on this progressive increase of responsibility, of burden, that derive from the sheer losses that start to occur during combat all over the army. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, energy in action expresses the strength of the motive through which the action is excited. Let the motive have its origin in a conviction of the understanding or in an impulse, but the latter can hardly ever be wanting where great force is to show itself. So here this is a kind of a parenthesis that von Clausewitz opens, and basically says that obviously, when you have to take an energetic decision as a commander, you must have accordingly a proportionate motive that pushes you. Now this can derive both from, let's say, reason and feelings. And what von Clausewitz specifies in here is that feelings are equally important. Like, you can be a very smart person, but we have observed in previous videos that if you don't have that ability, that determination, that resolution to take on, it's a form of courage essentially, to take action when it's needed. Well, you can't really do much with your intelligence, right? So that you may know what the best option is, but you don't have the guts to take it, right? So that he specifies that the great force, so the great commander, is usually a person that also has a lot of this feeling, right? Of this impulse that goes beyond the mere understanding, that has to comfort it and fuel it in a certain manner, and something that he has to be convinced of. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, of all the noble feelings which fill the human heart in the exciting tumult of battle, none, we must admit, are so powerful and constant as the soul's thirst for honor and renown, or glory if you prefer, which the German language treats so unfairly and tends to depreciate by the unworthy associations in the words Ehrgeiz, greed of honor, and Ruhmsucht, hankering after glory, right? Basically, yeah, this is true. Basically, von Clausewitz is observing that anthropologically speaking, in terms of feelings and how these are felt by people, this thirst for, first of all, honor and renown are the most powerful and constant elements of that are able to fill the human heart in the exciting tumult of battle, right? And then he makes this linguistical notation for which he says that there are these two words that split the concept. One is Ehrgeiz, that is literally this Geiz would be Gier, there is greed or avidity, right? And here is honor. And Ruhmsucht is this literal, Ruhm is glory and Sucht is search, so hankering after glory, right? And he points this out, if anything, because he's writing German, so he he wanted to make clear that actually this thirst for honor and glory is really one thing. It can't be split like in this case the German language does, right? And you can confrontate this, for example, in your own language, how it's expressed, and I think it's interesting. And so let's repeat. This is particularly important. Basically, of all the noble feelings, it's important. And normally we, as a society, I believe, as a culture in the West, we associate thirst of glory, for honor and renown, let's say, as a negative thing, right? That guy just wants glory, because glory is empty, right? Glory is not empty, really. I mean, it's really, now we don't have time to digress on it, but and that's, I believe, this, say, interpretations are of our own culture are very meaningful on about the certain, in this case, pacifistic prejudices. Let's be honest about it. The thirst of glory is nothing wrong. I mean, actually, it's a very powerful driving factor. It doesn't exclude remaining honest, humble. I mean, humble maybe not, but it really depends on what you mean. Even modest person. I mean, take von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz here, here is a pretty modern thinker. Modest thinker, in the sense that he doesn't overload. You can't feel that he knows what he's doing, right? He understands it's big, but at the same time, he doesn't care much of personal gain, in the sense it's not really a good comparison, but still there is, if you have a name and you want to pursue it, you need this kind of aggressivity, kind of a sense of purpose, of getting it through fame and glory and honor and renown is important. It's something that can better your life and can, even achieving that goal can obviously, like a victory, can sensibly improve your own country's fortune, etc. So it's really a positive thing. There is nothing bad about it. It's like in competitions, in sport. What's wrong? If you compete on the, under the flag of your country in a competition, there is a sane thirst for honor and renown that actually helps to compete. It's still kind. I get it. I mean, it's controversial. I'm not saying it's all full. I've always been wondering, for example, whether, in competition, what is where's the limit between, let's say, sane, healthy competition and just this exhibitionist, or maybe, in fact, a cynic view of the thing. Like, I want to win, I want to impose myself on others. But here it doesn't matter. Here, what really matters is that this is really something that can be used for good, right? And that is the most powerful, right? And constant. And now we'll explain, especially because why it's constant and why therefore it's so precious and the most important. That is able to fill the human heart in the exciting tumult of battle, right? Von Clausewitz goes on, and now we explain it better. No doubt it is just in war that the abuse of these proud aspirations of the soul must bring upon the human race the most shocking outrages, but by their origin they are certainly to be counted amongst the noblest feelings which belong to human nature, and in war they are the vivifying principle which gives the enormous body a spirit. So here from Clausewitz, you understand his intelligence is saying, this thirst for honor and glory as an aspiration of the soul can and does bring, actually, sometimes on the most shocking outrages of the human race, right? It is true that in the name of glory and honor, entire, countries are being wiped out. The most ferocious atrocities have been committed, the greatest crimes against humanity, and so on. And this is what happens in war all the time. I mean, when you fight a war, you can't pretend that you're the good guy, in absolute terms. I mean, you can't have the best motive, you can't be someone who respects the rules, etc. But war is unavoidably bringing civilians to die, innocents to die, right? It's standard. Every time you start a war, you know that you're gonna commit a crime in some part, which doesn't mean that wars are unjustified. Justification is something that pertains to the to the moral understand to the moral system of the person. Von Clausewitz doesn't debate it. He actually points out that in the name of such thirst for glory and honor, innocents die in the most horrible, unjust, ferocious, and effete ways, right? In cruel ways. But these aspirations must still be considered counted amongst the noblest feelings which belong to human nature. And in war, they are the vivifying principle which gives the enormous body a spirit. So in other words, from a moral point of view, what really fulfills this strength of will, this determination, this resolution, comes from ambition. And here Von Clausewitz explains why, because this is, it's not so intuitive, but once you get it, it's actually very, very clear. In fact, he writes, although other feelings may be more general in their influence, and many of them, such as love of country, fanaticism, revenge, enthusiasm of every kind, may seem to stand higher, the thirst for honor and renown still remains indispensable. And I continue with the next phrase because it explains definitely what it is. Those other feelings may arouse, right? So love of country, fanaticism, revenge may arouse the great masses in general and excite them more powerfully, but they do not give the leader a desire to will more than others, which is an essential requisite in his position if he is to make himself distinguished in it. So this is very, very, very important. Von Clausewitz here is saying basically that you can excite a population with things like patriotism, fanaticism, revenge, many other feelings of every kind. And apparently, and this is where von Clausewitz gets refined, because it makes you understand he tells you what is really instinctive to believe, and what generally people believe, but it's not the case. That these reasons seem to stand higher, right? But it is not true. It's really the thirst for honor and renown that remains indispensable. That is, you can't do with all of this, but just having an ambitious general, right? And that will work. In fact, he says those other feelings may arouse the great masses in general, right? So love of country, fanaticism, revenge usually work for the masses, but the masses are masses, right? You can arm them, but they're not. They have to be led. They can't act separately as many leaders. It doesn't work, and these feelings do not work like that. And what is interesting here says that even such feelings may excite the people more powerfully, right? So that is definitely, and we know this. We know it from dictatorships and totalitarianisms, and how they came to power sometimes even legally because they were fueled by things like this, like nationalism, like racism, like sense of revenge. Think about the eternal struggle at this point in the 19th and 20th century between France and Germany. This idea of revenge, the idea we want to kill those bastards because we hate their guts, right? So here von Clausewitz even admits that such feelings excite the masses brutally and a lot, right? But when it comes to leadership, so Wu has eventually to take the matter into his own hands in order to lead a war proper. Well, it is really the thirst for honor and glory, this ambition that makes the work done, right? And there is no other point. So the general, paradoxically, can be someone that doesn't care anything about the country, or fanaticism, or revenge, etc. This is a very interesting thought, actually, which is not always the case, telling the truth. And such feelings can even be probably, a problem. But let's say that it's as if through the ranks there was a process of selection, for which those who work, those higher ranks, if they were, promoted with, for merit, effectively, probably are not the people who care more about those things, but really maybe they're the more ambitious, right? So ambition really plays a lot of side of this, and this is important because, once again, our culture has made of the highest. So as a consequence, you understand the greatest generals tend to have greater ambition. So you cannot have a great general and not to have corresponding great ego, right? But it's as if a part of our culture, especially, I'm talking from a Western perspective, is fundamentally obsessed and phobic and at the level of parasitism towards egomaniacal figures. Egomaniacal behaviors are wrong, but let's say the idea that every big guy is a sort of new Hitler, basically, because he's just a freaking ambitious person that doesn't give a damn about others. Well, yeah, welcome to the real world. I mean, we know how certain individuals reach to the top. Very successful people are hardly very, let's say, positive people, humanly speaking, in the way we I mean, the two things do not necessarily correspond, and most of the times probably they do not correspond. You cannot look at, a great commander in this sense if he doesn't have this great ambition. And you can't criticize it. You can't say, well, maybe this guy did it because he's he's aggressive, he's competitive, he's egoistic, right? Yeah, okay, but this is the important. That is the person who makes the thing, has the thing made done, right? And you can't do without these people. That's the point in war. That is to say, the masses are a bunch of they're a chaos, a multitude that can be easily excited, and this is actually the prerogative of the people in Clausewitzian. In the Clausewitzian Trinity, but the people is the element that is more imbued with this sense of this emotional dimension, right? That can be easily excited. Then eventually the policy has to channel and to fuel even the military commitment into it. But he who has to lead has to have necessarily thirst for honor and glory. More than else. And if you think about it, it's not really, as I was saying before, it's not negative. I mean, it's strange that I have to apologize for saying this, but here von Clausewitz considers, in fact, some of all the noble feelings. Because at the end of the day, I believe that these behaviors are not antisocial at all. Actually, they serve society in a way or another. Even if you look at these great figures of politicians, of commanders, I don't know, Cromwell comes into my mind. I know there are lots of people that hate Cromwell. I kind of like him. And at that point, you realize even great leaders, great monarchs, etc., they're not actually privileged people. They're people who live a terrible life. This classist, I don't know, that classist thinking is probably one of the most idiotic things, but it's so widespread. People still believe in this. Do you think that Louis XIV was a happy person? He was actually depressed. He cried. He saw lots of, well, he was also unfortunate. He saw some all of his closest relatives dying and all. But think about, in this sense, the burden that a person has to guide, to guide hundreds of thousands of people to war continuously, and people dying, getting killed. That this is the kind of burden that these people get. So being at the top, and this is, it doesn't mean to be happy to have made it because you're necessarily someone who made it on the skin of other people. It can happen, but it's not entirely like that. There's this ambition for oneself that makes you competitive, makes you reach that place. And you can say that, who criticizes these individuals probably is the person who, in fact, takes things emotionally. Like, that is mostly excited for things like patriotism or fanaticism or revenge and stuff like that. And that do not get the point of what it means to have an ambition and to pursue it and to be even egoistic into the process, but maybe accomplishing a pretty good result. Pretty good, not just military, but actually political or civil or scientific or sportive achievement from which society can benefit, right? These military commanders are theoretically there because they have to make their country win wars, which is a positive thing, right? So I know it's controversial, but I don't really see it. I mean, I partly see it, but it's still a great quality that doesn't have to be dismissed like, that guy's just an egoist. Well, it's not really the same. And by the way, I don't think it's actually only the same thing. Possibly is, but it also doesn't mean that you don't do it for some... that this ambition has to be fueled by something else. I mean, the ambition itself towards honor and glory is can be dictated even by other reasons. Maybe you want to do it for someone, or for proving something to yourself. I mean, there are many reasons for which this can happen, and there are certain individuals that are definitely attracted to it. Maybe too much, right? So the higher you go in the ranks, and the more you find this kind of behavior. Let me see here where we were. Okay, for Clausewitz goes on and says, they do not, like a thirst for honor, make the military act especially the property of the leader, which he strives to turn to the best account. Where he plows with toil, sows with care, that he may reap plentifully. Right. It is true, these aspirations we have been speaking of in commanders, from the highest to the lowest, this sort of energy, this spirit of emulation, these incentives that the action of armies is chiefly animated and made successful. In other words, this competition, this idea of progressing or making it to the top, is what makes really more good to the army complexively, right? So that this obviously may not be as great, doesn't matter how much egos are large. It's not really it doesn't make for the prevalent spirit of the whole army, but it's the element that is, if channeled properly, is the one that makes the army working the best, right? Made successful, as von Clausewitz says. And then he says, and now as to that which especially concerns the head of all, we ask, has there ever been a great commander destitute of the love of honor, or is such a character even conceivable? Right, and this is obviously a rhetorical question, and it's obviously no, right? So this is particularly important. Then von Clausewitz makes the last consideration, that is partly what we were referring to before, that makes the difference between firmness and staunchness. Firmness denotes the resistance of the will in relation to the force of a single blow. Staunchness is in relation to a continuance of blows, right? So the difference is pretty clear. Now he explains it. It says, close as is the analogy between the two, because obviously there is, and often as the one is used in place of the other, still there is a notable difference between them which cannot be mistaken, inasmuch as firmness against a single powerful impression may have its root in the mere strength of a feeling, but staunchness must be supported rather by the understanding. For the greater the duration of an action, the more systematic deliberation is connected with it, and from this staunchness partly derives its power. So, this is important. So he says basically you can be firm, which means that at the moment you're able to stand your ground, not to lose your mind, and to get the thing done. But staunchness is more important because it allows you to repeat this over and over again. So von Clausewitz explains that firmness can be the, let's say, even derived from the passion of a minute, right, or more evidently, but let's say it can be a contingency, while staunch and instinctual, emotional, sentimental, right, while staunchness instead something that is driven or supported by reason. That is, you have to have a good reason in order to withstand these blows time after time, right? Firmness, you may be caught in one of these troubles once and stand your ground in making it through. Staunchness is basically you getting into it and knowing that you can resist to these several blows, or at least that you're capable of doing and not running away when it's required. And what is interesting is that let's say that partly fuels the same feeling. That is to say, that reason operates in staunchness in order to support even firmness in the single element. So it gives you this extra energy that pumps yourself, right? I'm able to do it, right? And you load yourself in, and you're able to get it through. So, okay, this was it today. We're getting into, I would say, rather long passages at this point, and this means that we're going slightly more speedily than the usual, but I think it's fine, so that we can even make the contents a bit more compact. But I'm following this this rhythm because the concepts really need an explanation, a prolonged explanation, but also there is I'm trying to identify within the text really the various chunks into which it's split, because the paragraphs in here do not chapters do not have marked paragraphs within them, so you have to find them because they're very long chapters. But okay, and we will go on and on. There's so much to say. This chapter is particularly long, and then but it's important to focus on this reason and feeling all the time, because it's really what makes the work done. And at this point I'm quite satisfied by the fact that we arrived at this point. At least it's a good, I believe it's more than 1/10 of the Vom Kriege at this point, so we're still at the beginning. Nevertheless, we have been able to cover enough stuff. And okay, so for now this is it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, or otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.